The fifth note said, "Stop pretending you don't see me." I read it 3 times, standing at my car in the parking lot of our building at 7 in the morning, with a coffee I hadn't started yet, and a week's worth of context that suddenly felt completely insufficient. I had found the first note on a Tuesday, the second on a Friday, the third the following Monday, and the fourth the Thursday after that. Each one folded in half and tucked under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket, except no parking ticket has ever made me stand in a cold parking lot wondering what kind of person I actually was. The fifth one made me wonder if I had been wrong about something important for longer than I wanted to admit. I put it in my jacket pocket. I went to work. I thought about it the entire day without reaching a single useful conclusion, which is the kind of thinking that looks like productivity, but is actually just anxiety wearing a collared shirt. My name is Owen. I'm 34 years old, and I live in a 6-story building in a neighborhood that is exactly in between gentrified and not yet, which means the coffee is expensive and the parking is a problem. I moved in 18 months ago, after the end of a relationship that had lasted long enough to leave furniture opinions and a very specific kind of quiet in my apartment that I was still learning to fill with something other than work. I manage operations for a mid-sized logistics company, which is a job that rewards the ability to notice things that are out of place, to track patterns, to understand when a system is running well and when something is quietly wrong. I am, professionally, good at paying attention, which made the notes more embarrassing than they would have been for someone whose job description did not include the words operational awareness. The first note arrived on a Tuesday in October, 14 months after I moved in. I had not been sleeping well that week, some combination of a difficult project and a recurring awareness that my apartment was very quiet at 11 p.m., and again at 3 a.m. I went to my car at 7:15, late for a meeting, and found the note under the wiper. It said, in handwriting that was small and very neat, "Your left rear tire looks low, just so you know." That was all. No name, no apartment number, nothing identifying. I checked the tire. It was low. I added air at the gas station 2 blocks over and made my meeting by 4 minutes and did not think about the note again for the rest of the day, which says something about how I was engaging with my own life at that point. I filed it as a kind gesture from an anonymous neighbor and moved on. The second note arrived on a Friday, 11 days later. This one said, "The deli on Merchant Street has better sandwiches than the place you go to on your lunch break. The turkey one. You should try it." I stood at my car for slightly longer this time. Someone had noticed not just my tire, but my lunch routine. Someone in this building knew which deli I went to and had opinions about my choices. The note was not threatening. It was not strange in any alarming way. It was simply the kind of thing someone says when they have been watching a person's habits with more attention than a casual neighbor typically invests. I put it in my glove box. I went to work. On my lunch break, I walked to the deli on Merchant Street and ordered the turkey sandwich, and it was genuinely, significantly better than the one I had been getting, which was an uncomfortable validation that made me feel surveilled and grateful at the same time. The third note arrived on a Monday, 9 days after the second. This one said, "The woman in 4C has been watering her plants on the exterior windowsill, and the runoff is going to damage the window frame on the unit below hers. If you know the building manager, you might mention it." I did not personally know the building manager. I did not personally know anyone in the building beyond the man on my floor, who nodded at me in the hallway, and the woman near the mailboxes, who had once asked me to hold a package. But I did mention the window situation to the front desk the next morning, because the note was right that it was going to be a problem, and the front desk person handled it, and the problem was prevented. I was now on my third interaction with an anonymous neighbor, who had a better working knowledge of this building than I did, despite having apparently lived here for a comparable amount of time, who had identified 2 practical issues and 1 lifestyle upgrade that had all turned out to be correct, and whose handwriting I had begun to recognize instantly. The third note went into my jacket pocket, where I found it 3 days later doing laundry and stood in the laundromat holding it for a moment before putting it in the specific drawer in my kitchen where I had, without quite deciding to, begun to keep them. The fourth note was different from the first 3, and I knew it the second I read it. The first 3 had been useful, operational, almost. The kind of notes a building-aware person leaves for a building-unaware neighbor. The fourth one said, "I've been watching you come and go for about a year, and I think you're probably a better person than the face you make when you're walking to your car in the morning suggests. The face in question is the face of someone who is going through something and has decided not to mention it to anyone. I've had that face. I just thought you should know someone noticed. I stood at my car in the parking lot for a full 2 minutes that morning, not because the note was alarming, because it was accurate in a way that felt like being seen by someone who had not been given permission to see me, and my immediate response to that was something more complicated than simple discomfort. Something that sat lower than discomfort and felt, if I was honest with myself, closer to relief. Someone had noticed. Someone in this building had been paying enough attention to notice and had chosen to say something, which meant someone in this building had been paying attention at all, which meant I had not been as invisible in the way I had been quietly trying to make myself as I thought. The fourth note went into the kitchen drawer with the others. I took a slightly different route to the subway that morning and spent the first 20 minutes of my commute thinking about the face I made when I walked to my car. The fifth note arrived on a Thursday and said, "Stop pretending you don't see me," which was true. I had been pretending. By the third note, I had developed a hypothesis about which unit the notes were coming from, based on the knowledge of the building they demonstrated, the window situation mentioned in Note 3, and the particular angle of observation required to have noticed both my tire and my lunch routine, which suggested a specific side of the building and a specific floor range. I had not tested the hypothesis. I had not knocked on any doors. I had collected the notes and kept them in a kitchen drawer and taken the turkey sandwich recommendation and had done nothing else, which was, the fifth note, correctly identified, a form of pretending. I stood in the parking lot with the fifth note in my hand and thought about the 4 in the kitchen drawer and thought about the face I made walking to my car that a stranger had apparently found significant enough to write down, and I thought about how I was professionally good at noticing things that were out of place and had somehow managed to treat the most interesting thing that had happened in my building since I moved in as an ambient background event rather than something worth responding to. And then I put the note in my pocket and went to work and thought about it all day and came home and stood in my kitchen for 10 minutes and went and knocked on the door of Unit 3F. I want to tell you what I had prepared to say, because what I had prepared was perfectly reasonable and not at all what came out. I had prepared. I think you've been leaving notes on my car, and I wanted to say thank you, and also, I'd like to know who you are. Clean, direct, appropriately casual. What came out when the door opened was nothing at all, because the person who opened the door was not who I had been expecting, not that I had expected anyone specific, and the not expecting caught me at a disadvantage that I immediately and unsuccessfully tried to cover with an expression of calm. Her name was Diana. She was 32, dark hair cut just below her ears, the kind of eyes that look like they are always in the middle of calculating something, wearing a paint-stained gray sweater and holding a small jar of something blue in her left hand. She looked at me for approximately 1 second and said, "I was wondering when you'd come." I said, "It took me 5 notes." She said, "It took you 4. You came on the 5th. I said, "That's a distinction without a difference." She said, "Is it?" And she stepped back from the door and made a small gesture that I understood was an invitation, and I walked into her apartment, which smelled like paint and something baking. And I understood immediately that whoever this person was, she had been paying attention to considerably more than my tire pressure and my lunch choices, and that whatever had been happening in that parking lot over the past several weeks had been, from her side, entirely intentional from the beginning. Her apartment was the same layout as mine 1 floor below, which I noticed immediately and professionally, but organized in a way that made it feel like a completely different spatial logic. One wall was almost entirely covered in what I would learn were her own paintings, nothing representational, colors and layers that looked like they were having a conversation with each other that I didn't quite have the vocabulary for. There were books on every horizontal surface in a system that had its own internal logic I couldn't immediately decode. A large table near the window was covered in what appeared to be reference materials for something, photographs and handwritten notes and several open books, and the blue jar in her hand, I understood now, contained paint rather than anything edible. She put it on the table and wiped her hand on her sweater and sat in the chair nearest the window, in the way of someone who sits in that chair so often it has become the default setting for her body. I stood near the door for a moment and then sat on the end of the sofa nearest to her, because standing felt performative, and sitting felt like a decision I was making, which was the honest version of what was happening. She looked at me, I looked at her. The apartment was warm and smelled like something with vanilla in it, baking in an oven I couldn't see. I said, "Why didn't you just introduce yourself?" She said, "I tried. You don't look at people in this building." I said, "I look at people." She said, "You look through people. There's a difference. You weren't ready to actually see anyone yet, so I tried something else." I want to tell you I had a good response to that. I didn't. Because she was right, and I knew she was right, and the specific sensation of being correctly described by someone you've never spoken to is one of the more disorienting experiences available to a person who has spent a year and a half believing they were moving through a building. Invisibly. I said, "What made you think notes would work?" She said, "You kept them." I said, "How do you know I kept them?" She said, "Because you came." People who throw things away don't come back for more information about them. I looked at her. I said, "That's either very perceptive or a complete guess." She said, "Both." She had a small, direct smile that arrived and left quickly, like it was for her rather than for me, and I thought about the fourth note, about the line "I've had that face," and I understood that whoever Diana was, she had learned something from watching people that I had been trying to learn from managing systems, which was that the information a person gives you without knowing they're giving it is often more accurate than anything they say directly. I stayed for 2 hours. Not because I planned to, not because either of us made it deliberate, but because the conversation began and did not find a natural place to end for 2 hours, which was the most surprised I had been by anything in approximately 18 months. She was a graphic designer who worked from home, which explained the knowledge of the building's rhythms and the specific attention to exterior details like the window runoff situation. She had grown up in this city, moved into this building 3 years ago, after a period in another neighborhood that she described as aesthetically loud, by which she meant there had been too much happening visually on every surface, and she had found it exhausting. She had chosen this building for its brick exterior and the way the light came through the parking lot trees in the afternoon, and I said I had chosen it for the price and the proximity to the subway. And she looked at me with an expression that I would come to learn meant she found something both funny and slightly sad, which was a very specific expression and one I would eventually become very familiar with. She asked about the thing I was going through, the thing the fourth note had referenced, the thing the face communicated in the morning. I told her, not all of it, not the way I would tell it a year later, but enough. Enough that she understood the approximate shape of the 18 months and what the quiet in my apartment at 3 a.m. actually meant. She listened in the way she had apparently been watching the parking lot, with complete and unhurried attention, not filling silence before it was finished, not moving toward the reassuring conclusion before the actual thing was said. When I finished, she said, "That makes sense of the face." Not, "Sorry about the face." Not, "Your face will get better." Just that makes sense of the face, which was exactly the right thing to say, and which I didn't realize was exactly the right thing to say until I was in the elevator going back to my apartment and felt something in my chest that had been held at a particular tension. For quite a long time, released slightly, the way a system does when a problem that has been running in the background finally gets addressed. I left a note on her car the next morning. It was a deliberate inversion, and I knew it, and I did it anyway, because sometimes the honest move is also the slightly obvious one, and there is nothing wrong with that. The note said, "The coffee from the cart on the corner is better than the place you go to." And yes, I had noticed where she got her coffee. I had been paying more attention than I thought. She texted me at 9:45, which meant she had found my number somehow, which I asked her about when I saw her in the hallway 2 days later, and she said the building directory, which the building had and I had apparently never looked at. The text said, "The cart on the corner runs out of the good roast by 8:15. You have to get there early," which meant she had tested the recommendation immediately and found the operational limitation, and I read that text 3 times and understood that whatever was beginning between us was going to involve 2 people who both paid attention in ways that most people found slightly excessive, and that the combination was either going to be clarifying or chaotic, and possibly both at the same time. We had dinner the following Saturday. I suggested the deli on Merchant Street because it seemed correct, both practically and as a reference to where this had started. And she agreed, and we sat in a window booth and talked for 3 hours, which was longer than the first conversation but felt shorter, which is the measurement I use for the quality of time spent with a person. She told me about her work, about the specific satisfaction of solving a visual problem that other people had found intractable, about the client the previous month who had insisted on a logo in a color that was going to photograph badly under any lighting, and how she had spent 4 days finding the version of the argument that was both accurate and receivable. I told her about logistics, about the particular pleasure of a system running cleanly, about the quarter I had spent fixing a routing problem that had been costing the company 4% efficiency for 2 years without anyone being able to locate the source. She said it sounded like finding the right note at the right time. I said that was a generous reading. She said most accurate readings are generous ones. We walked back to the building in the November cold and stopped at the door, and she said, "You know, I was watching you for about 6 months before the first note." I said, 6 months. She said, "I wanted to make sure I wasn't wrong about you." I said, "And you weren't." She said, "I wasn't." The door between us and the warm lobby was right there, and neither of us opened it for a moment, just standing in the cold outside a building we both lived in. And then she said goodnight and went inside, and I stood there for a second, thinking that whoever said attention was a form of love had probably been right, because being watched carefully by a person who kept what they saw, rather than using it against you, was one of the stranger and more complete gifts I had received in some time. The notes continued after that, which neither of us had planned or discussed, but which happened anyway, because some forms of communication become their own language, and you don't stop speaking a language just because you've also started speaking in another one. Hers left on my car, mine under her door, not every day, not on any schedule, just when one of us noticed something worth noticing. She left one in February that said the light in the stairwell on the 3rd floor has been flickering for 2 weeks and someone should report it, which I did. I left one in March that said the new coffee cart on the corner charges 20 cents more than the old one and the roast is the same, which she tested and confirmed. On an evening in April, she texted me a photograph of the parking lot from her window at the angle from which she had apparently watched me for 6 months before the first note, and I looked at it for a long time, trying to understand what she had seen from that angle, and finally texted back, "What did you notice first?" She replied, "The way you stopped at your car every morning and looked up at the building before you got in, like you were checking that it was still there." I didn't reply to that for a while because I didn't have words for it that weren't more than I was ready to give in a text. I called her instead, which was the first time I had called rather than texted, and she picked up on the second ring and said, "Too much?" I said, "No." I said, "I didn't know I did that." She said, "Most people don't know what they do until someone tells them." I said, "Is that why you started with the notes?" She said, "I started with the notes because I thought if I just told you your tire was low, you'd say thank you and never think about it again. But if I left a note, you'd wonder." I said, "I wondered." She said, "I know. You came on the 5th one." The thing about being known gradually by someone who has been paying attention is that it does not arrive with the drama of a revelation. It arrives the way the tire situation arrived, quietly and practically, as something that simply makes the next day go better than it would have otherwise. By the time I understood what Diana was to me, I had already been living inside it for months, which is exactly the way she had apparently designed it. Not as a manipulation, but as a patience, the way a good designer waits for the problem to show itself fully before proposing a solution. I told her this in June, sitting on the floor of her apartment in front of the painting wall, while she explained the logic of a color sequence she had been working on for 3 weeks. And she turned and looked at me with the expression I had come to love, the small, quick one that was for her rather than for me, and said, "You're describing yourself." I said, "How so?" She said, "You're someone who needs to see the whole system before you trust it. I needed you to see enough of it." I looked at her for a moment, this person who had watched a parking lot for 6 months and decided on a strategy of patient accumulation and had been right about all of it, and I said, "You knew I'd come eventually." She said, "I knew you'd come if I gave you enough to be curious about. I wasn't sure of anything else." I said, "What if I'd thrown them away?" She said, "Then I would have been wrong about you." I said, "You weren't wrong." She looked at me. She said, "I know." And she turned back to the painting and said, The blue on the left needs to move about an inch, and I can't figure out why. And I looked at the blue, and I said, "It's competing with the edge." She stopped. She looked at the blue and then at me. She said, "You can see that?" I said, "It's a routing problem." She laughed, a full one, and the apartment was warm and the evening light was coming through the window at the angle she had apparently chosen this building for. And I thought about the face I made in the parking lot in the mornings, and about the person who had seen it from 3 floors up, and decided it was worth something, and I understood that the notes had never really been about the tire or the sandwich or the window situation. They had been about whether I was paying the kind of attention that made me worth paying attention to. And the 5th one had been right. I had been seeing her for months. I had just been pretending otherwise, which is the thing you do when something matters too much to look at directly, when seeing it clearly means you'll have to do something about it. And doing something about it means accepting that you want something, and wanting something means you could lose it, and losing things is the specific fear that makes the face in the parking lot in the morning. I moved the blue about an inch on her painting, at her direction, with a small brush she handed me without ceremony, and it was right, and she looked at it and said, "How?" I said, "You just needed to move it away from the edge so it wasn't fighting." She said, "You're not talking about the painting." I said, "No." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Are you going to keep leaving notes?" I said, "Are you?" She said, "Probably." I said, "Then yes." She leaned back against the sofa behind her and looked at the painting, and I sat on her floor in June, in the apartment that smelled like paint and something baking, and I thought about the 5 notes in the kitchen drawer 1 floor below, and about the person sitting 3 feet away who had spent 6 months deciding whether I was worth the risk of being known by, and about how the best systems are not the ones you build from scratch, but the ones you discover were already there, already running, already carrying something important, and you just needed to pay attention long enough to find them. We have been together for 8 months now. The notes still happen, because neither of us stopped, because the language belongs to us now, and you don't give back a language because you've started using another one too. Last week she left one on my car that said, "You left your umbrella in the lobby again, 3rd time this month." I left one under her door that said, "The blue in the new piece is in the right place." She texted back a photograph of it with 1 word, "Finally." And I looked at it, the painting on the wall of her apartment that I now knew well enough to have opinions about, and I thought about 5 notes and 6 months of watching, and 1 parking lot, and a woman who had decided that patience was a form of saying, "I think you're worth this," which, it turned out, was all I had needed someone to say. I just hadn't known I was waiting for it. She had. I've thought a lot about what it means to be noticed by someone who doesn't need anything from you. Most of the noticing I've experienced in my adult life has been transactional in one direction or another. People notice the things about you that are useful to them, that confirm something they already believed, that give them leverage or access or a reason to keep you at a distance they can manage. Diana's noticing was different from the first note, and I didn't understand why until much later. Until I was standing in her apartment, looking at a painting she had spent 3 weeks on, and realized I had been tracking it in my peripheral vision for months. Watching it develop through the gaps in her open door when I passed in the hallway, filing away the changes without deciding to, and that this was exactly what she had been doing with me in the parking lot. 2 people accumulating information about each other, without either of them quite declaring that the accumulation was intentional. The difference was that she knew she was doing it. I just thought I was living in a building. What I understand now, 8 months into knowing her properly, is that Diana had identified the thing I was doing with the quiet in my apartment and the face in the morning, long before she left the first note, and that what the notes actually were was a calibration test, a way of finding out whether I was the kind of person who noticed things back. The tire note told her whether I'd check the tire or just move on. The sandwich note told her whether I'd try it or be too settled in my habits to be moved. The window note told her whether I'd act on information that wasn't my direct problem. The 4th note, the one about the face, was the question she'd been building toward, the one that said, "I've been watching you, and I think there might be something worth watching," and the 5th note was the consequence of my not answering, the notice that the test had a time limit. I told her this theory in July, lying on the floor of her apartment with the painting wall above us, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "The tire was a genuine observation." The sandwich was because I'd tried both, and the other one actually is worse. The window was a real problem, I said. And the fourth one? She said, the fourth one was the test. I said, and the fifth? She said, the fifth was impatience. I've been patient for most of my life, and occasionally it gives out. I looked at her. I said, I'm glad it gave out. She said, so am I. And she turned back to looking at the ceiling with the particular focused blankness she wore when she was thinking through a visual problem. And I lay there in the warm apartment and thought about patience and systems and the way a person who is very good at waiting can still run out, and felt something I had been carrying at a particular careful distance for 18 months finally put itself down. There is a drawer in my kitchen that still has the 5 original notes in it. I have not moved them. Diana has been in my apartment enough times to have seen the drawer open and to know what's in it and to have said nothing about it, which is consistent with who she is, which is someone who does not require her own significance to be verbally confirmed because she can see it in the evidence. I know this because I asked her once, in September, whether it seems strange that I kept them, and she said, people keep things that change something. It would be stranger if you'd thrown them away. I said, I almost threw away the first one. She said, I know, you checked the tire at the gas station 2 blocks over and looked at the note before you put it in your glove box. I stared at her. She said, I was getting coffee. I happened to see it. I said, you were watching me at the gas station. She said, I was getting coffee and you were at the gas station, and I noticed. I said, there's a difference between noticing and watching. She looked at me with the small, quick smile and said, is there? And I understood that she had been making this argument for 8 months and would continue to make it indefinitely because the distinction between watching and noticing was one she found genuinely interesting rather than settled, and that this was one of the things about her I had not expected, and which had turned out to be one of the things I liked most. She did not consider the questions closed. She kept them open the same way she kept the paint on a canvas open until she was sure, the same way she had kept me at the distance of a folded note under a windshield wiper until she knew enough about me to close it. The painting with the blue is finished now. She moved it to a different wall 2 months ago, the one across from the window, and the light hits it differently in the afternoon, and when it does, the blue reads completely differently than it does in the morning, which she had apparently planned, and which I had not noticed until she pointed it out. At which point, I felt the specific combination of appreciation and mild competitive annoyance that is one of the reliable textures of being with someone who is very good at their work. I told her it was a good move. She said she knew. I said, did you plan the afternoon light from the beginning? She said, from the second week. I said, what happened in the second week? She said, I understood what the painting was actually about. I asked what it was about. She was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was deciding how much to give. Then she said, it's about the distance between where you can see something from and where you have to be to actually reach it. I looked at the painting. I looked at the blue, which was in exactly the right place, which I had helped move 1 inch in June on a warm evening on her floor, and I thought about parking lots and notes and 6 months of watching and a distance that had closed 1 note at a time, and I said, you started it before the first note. She said, I started it about 3 months before the first note. I said, what were you painting before that? She said, I didn't know yet. I just knew the blue was in the wrong place. And I looked at the painting, this thing she had built over the course of a year, while she was also, as it turned out, deciding something about a parking lot and a person she had not yet spoken to. And I thought about systems and patience and the specific discipline of waiting until you understand the problem fully before you try to solve it. And I thought about a face in a parking lot that had communicated something a stranger had found worth paying attention to, and about the 5 notes in my kitchen drawer. And I said, I'm glad you knew where to move it. She looked at me. She said, I had help. And the afternoon light came through the window and hit the blue exactly where she had planned it to, and it was, as she had apparently always known, it would be exactly right. Last Saturday, we walked to the deli on Merchant Street for lunch, which we do most Saturdays now, and sat in the same window booth I had sat in the first time 8 months ago. And she ordered the turkey sandwich, and I ordered something different because I had finally exhausted my interest in ordering the same thing every time. And she noticed and said nothing, which was itself a form of noticing. On the walk back, she stopped at the corner to look at something in a shop window, a print with an interesting color relationship that she had a thought about. And I stood beside her on the sidewalk and looked at it and waited. And after a moment she said, "The orange in the bottom left is doing something the designer didn't intend." I said, "What is it doing?" She said, "It's creating a second focal point that competes with the first one. The eye doesn't know where to go." I looked at it. I said, "You need to move it." She said, "Or remove it." But I think move it is more interesting, because the tension is actually the point. It just needs to be managed rather than eliminated. I looked at her looking at the print, and I thought about the things she had said about the painting, about the distance between where you can see something from and where you have to be to actually reach it. And I thought about an apartment building, parking lot, and a tire, and a sandwich, and a window situation, and 5 folded notes, and 6 months of patient watching that had covered the distance one observation at a time. I said, "You're good at managing tension." She turned and looked at me with a small, quick smile and said, "I've had practice." And we walked back to the building in the October cold, the same cold as the night she had mentioned she'd been watching me for 6 months before the first note. And I held the door for her, and she walked through it and said, without looking back, "You're not making the face anymore." I said, "What face?" She said, "The one from the parking lot. The one that said you were going through something." I thought about it. I said, "What do I look like now?" She stopped at the elevator and turned and looked at me with the careful, complete attention she brought to everything she actually looked at. She said, "You look like someone who knows the building is still there." And the elevator opened, and she stepped in, and I stepped in after her, and the doors closed, and I thought that was the most accurate thing anyone had said about me in a long time. And that the person who had been accurate about me, more consistently than anyone in recent memory, was someone I had almost never noticed in the first place, which was either a lesson in paying attention or a lesson in the limits of professional competence applied to personal life, and probably both, and probably that was fine. Because some things need to be brought to your attention from outside the system, tucked under a windshield wiper on an early Tuesday morning by someone 3 floors up who had decided, with patience and precision and the specific confidence of a person who trusts what she sees, that you were worth the risk of being noticed.